I mean, it's amazing that the United States of America, which used to be the beacon of democracy for the world, is now caught in this amazing political paralysis, and it can't make fundamental decisions about debt, about fiscal balancing, because of a total polarization.
A fundamental premise of America's democracy is that we have the ability to elect leaders that accurately reflect our beliefs. However, the increase in polarization along party lines by our representatives is making this harder and harder. This increase in polarization is reflected in this graph. If we look from the 1950s forward, we can see a huge increase in the distance between the parties in both the House and the Senate. We see a similar trend with Americans in general. The question is, why? First, we may think that this could be because of a change in the demographics of the population. However, as you can see here, there is almost no change in demographics while polarization increases dramatically. In this paper, Laurel Harvard cites the increased polarization of the American public as a possible reason for the increased partisanship in Congress. However, I would argue the opposite. I would say that the increased partisanship in Congress is the cause for the increased polarization of the American public. To see why, let's take the example of Tim. Tim feels very strongly that we should lower taxes. In fact, Tim supports a lot of things, but what he really cares about is lowering taxes. When it comes time to vote, Tim looks at the two parties and which of their policies he supports. If Tim knew the people he was voting for were fairly nonpartisan, he would feel comfortable voting for the people he aligned with most, knowing that they would deal with issues like lower taxes by coming to some sort of compromise in the middle. If the body that Tim is electing is known to be very partisan, even though Tim aligns more with the Democrats, he will still vote Republican because he knows that the issue that matters to him most will not be heard unless Republicans are in power. Now, in order for Tim to get the one thing he really wants, low taxes, he has to support all of the things that go along with that party. So now, because of a partisan Congress, Tim has now become very partisan himself. For example, look at the responses to this question over time. In the early 90s, there is virtually no difference in response based off of party. However, as Congress became more and more partisan, and since certain answers to this question are associated with certain parties, the answers became divided along party lines. One possible solution to this issue of partisanship in Congress leading to high political polarization in the people is to decrease the number of votes needed for cloture on co-sponsored bills. For example, the reason that 60 votes were needed to pass the recent amendment on the firearms bill for expanded background checks was that in order to not have to go through the process of cloture to end a filibuster of the amendment, which would have taken days and required 60 votes, it was agreed that 60 votes would be needed to make the bill pass, rather than the regular 50. This happens fairly often, and if we decrease the number of votes needed for cloture from 60 to say 55, if the bill has authors from both parties, it would incentivize bipartisanship and get the parties working together on a more frequent basis.